Thank you, Hazel. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Sarah Morgan from Rothamsted Research with a talk on assessing the environmental impacts of grazing management. Sarah's research interests are centred around producing products with enhanced nutritional quality from sustainable and efficient grass-based ruminant, both beef and sheep production systems. She has experience of carrying out research related to forage quality and meat quality, with particular emphasis on fatty acids. Sarah is now a postdoctoral research scientist at Rothamsted Research's North Wick site, managing a project assessing the environmental impacts of differing grazing management systems. If Sarah is ready, I'll hand over to her. I can see her slides coming up, fantastic. Dr. Sarah Morgan. It was muted, that's it, there we go.
Yeah. Thanks, Will, for the introduction. I'm Sarah Morgan, and I'm currently at Rothamsted Research in Northwick in Devon. I was previous to that at Aberystwyth, so I know the area well. So today I'm going to talk about grassland management and innovative grazing strategies. I'll start with a bit of a brief overview about grasslands in the UK and generally what they're used for and the different management styles that are available. And then I'll talk a bit about the project that I'm currently working on at Rothamsted, which is looking at the environmental impacts of contrasting grazing management systems. So in terms of the grasslands of the UK, as you're probably well aware, a lot of the utilised agricultural area in the UK is classed as grassland. It's just over 2/3 of the area, and that is covered with permanent and temporary grassland. From this map here, from NERC that was developed in 2011, you can see most of that grassland is on the west side of the UK, predominantly Wales, the southwest of England and Northern Ireland. And this grassland supports mainly the beef, sheep and dairy industries, which are common in the UK. However, the characteristics of these grasslands are very different depending on where you are in the country. So you've got quite a diverse range of sort of topography, pasture types, animals that are grazing, and also the type of management that the grasslands are under. So you can have sort of a range from sort of intensively managed pastures. There's an increasing interest in multi-species and herbal lays. Obviously, sometimes during the year you'll take silage cuts or conservation cuts. And also the size of these farms vary massively. So you've got sort of small holdings that are quite sort of low input, low output, sort of improved pastures and improved upland pastures. So although we lump most of these grasslands together, then in reality they're all quite different from each other. So as you've already heard from Raina a bit about the greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, and that's getting a bit of bad press at the moment in terms of grazing livestock and sort of sustainability as a whole. So the greenhouse gas emissions aren't the only issue in terms of when you're talking about sustainability as a whole. Sustainability is quite a often used term at the moment, but its definition varies massively. So here are just a few of the things that are or facets of sustainability. So you've got things like profitability, efficiency and productivity. At the end of the day, farming is a business, and that business needs to be viable in order to continue. We've got increasing climate change issues, which we're sort of seemingly experiencing more often recently. So your farming, seeing as it is based, you know, outside in the natural environment, you need to create systems that are resilient to that climate change and the sort of vast differences that we've seen in our weather patterns, etc. Soil is becoming a very important part. Well, it always has been important, but it's becoming more increasingly important as we realise the value of soil and soil stability and soil health. Water and air quality is becoming increased topic that's been spoken about. This is particularly something to keep an eye on, because I know in New Zealand they have had various issues with water quality relating to grazing livestock, and they are now implementing policies around water quality. And I envisage that also coming into practice in the UK in the future. Animal health and welfare is obviously a major part of sustainability, but that's also linked to profitability and efficiency. If your animals are fit, well and healthy, then they're going to be more productive. Habitat quality and species diversity, and also the landscape character and recreation. Now in the UK, a lot of the farmland and grasslands of the UK do form part of recreation and tourism for people, and that's also an important aspect of the system as a whole. But as I said, this down here kind of tries to summarize sustainability, but as I say, sustainability is a very vast topic, and quite convoluted, and very some things can be quite contradictory. So it's really, if you can't take one facet of sustainability and think you know the lot. So yeah. But that being said, there are a lot of positives to grazing livestock as well, which I know in the current climate are not being, these messages aren't being sort of promoted as well as they could be. There's smaller minorities, but seemingly with bigger voices, that are sort of against grazing livestock. But as I say, there are some positives, such as grazing livestock make use of non-arable land, particularly in terms of that map that I showed you where the grasslands are in the UK. That is a result of the topography there, and also the climate. We sometimes don't like the rain, but the rain makes the grass grow, so can't always have sunshine. In terms of ruminants, they're excellent at adding value to the human inedible crops, so things like grass. We can't eat them directly, but ruminants can, and they sort of add value to that grass by converting that into nutritious meat and milk. And they also use byproducts and waste streams. As mentioned, they produce highly nutritionally dense foods, particularly from grazing animals. So they've got beneficial fatty acids in the products, such as omega-3s and conjugated linoleic acids, which are good for human health. And they've also got a plethora of vitamins and minerals. They're very good protein sources. So in terms of the nutritional value of these products, then meat and milk are quite high on that list. And also they produce a lot of stuff out their back end, which actually is beneficial for soil. So we're starting to realise now that farmyard manures are beneficial for soil, and there's sort of increasing interest in getting livestock back into arable rotations, because the arable soils that have been managed through an arable system for such a long time, those soils are quite degraded now, and bringing farmyard manure back into those systems and grazing livestock is hopefully going to rebuild those soils and make them more resilient and more productive. So as I showed you earlier, the pictures of UK grassland are widely variable, and that is showing basically that the management of those grasslands is also hugely variable. So as I said, you've got different pasture types, from your highly productive perennial ryegrass monocultures, or perennial ryegrass and white clover, all the way through to your sort of permanent pastures that have not been improved or ploughed for many years, and also your hay meadows and your multi-species or herbal lay pastures. The different topography and terrain also has a effect on what styles of management you can implement. You've got different species, breeds and types of livestock, mainly sheep and cattle in the UK. But within those, there's a massive variety of breeds, which sadly we're missing out on seeing this year due to the virtual Royal Welsh. But yes, they are still there. And also the types. So you've got dairy, sort of high productive dairy cows versus native beef cattle. So that also plays into the type of management you have, and also different grazing systems, which will be the main focus of my talk. So in terms of grazing management, of managing, so set stocking, which is now becoming sort of unfashionable, that is when your fields are constantly grazed through the year and you have no active management of the sward heights. You just basically, when the weather allows and the soil allows, you put your animals out and let them get on with it until either they've eaten all the grass or the weather gets too bad. More commonly, you use sort of a continuous variable or rotational field management. So in terms of the continuous variable, you may change your stocking rate a bit, just to say if your sward heights are getting higher in some fields than others, you'll put more animals in them to bring that sward height down. Or you might fence pieces of the field off, so that you can either use that as deferred grazing or cut it for silage or hay at a later date. But the overall aim of the continuous stocking is to maintain a similar sward height throughout the grazing year. So you do that through changing your stocking rate or changing the area that the animals are grazing. And similar principles in the rotational field grazing. So you'll either adjust the stocking rate per field to suit how much grass is available, or shut fields off for silage making. And then, especially in terms of the dairy systems, strip grazing is becoming more popular. So this strip grazing here I'm particularly talking about is just a front fence strip grazing. So you just move that front fence forward every day or two, and the animals get access to new pasture. So the positives of these traditional grazing management systems is that they require minimal infrastructure. Basically, it's just the field boundaries that are already established. There's no issue in terms of access to water. You just use your traditional fixed concrete water trough or bathtub, stream. I know there's a massive range of watering points for cattle and sheep, and also there's a lower labour input, just because you're not moving your animals frequently. And in terms of the strip grazing, I know there's the front fence to move, but so that's just one electric fence to move, so it doesn't require a vast amount of time. However, the downsides to these types of grazing management is they use low to medium stocking rates, and that feeds into the fact that you've got no control over your grazing pressure. They've got no or short and infrequent rest periods. So in terms of the set stocking, that would have no rest. The continuous would depend on how the grass growth year goes, and whether you've got a surplus or deficit of grass. And the rotational strip grazing, again, they have some rest, but you're sort of at the whim of the climate and how the weather and the grass react. So you've not got an awful lot of flexibility in these types of systems. However, if we move on to more modern grazing management, which is becoming increasingly popular, so there's various different ways of doing these types of management, but they're loosely based on the same principles. So some people have done hub and spoke grazing. So that's just splitting your field or area into sort of divisions that are roughly equal, but also always coming back to the same point, which here is the water trough. Paddock grazing, so this is just subdividing your fields to smaller areas, just so that you have more control over sort of the areas that are being grazed and not being grazed in rest periods. Mob grazing is becoming increasingly popular, and that's sort of a step up from paddock grazing, really. So you've got very high stocking densities in mob grazing, but you move those animals frequently. And then you've also got cell grazing, which has similar ideas to mob grazing, but the way the cell grazing system is set up, you divide your field into what we call precise lanes, and we subdivide them into precise areas of usually about less than 0.1 hectare. And then within the system, you can very accurately allocate grazing areas to the animals per day and make sure that you're getting the maximum utilization of that grass out of those systems. And you can move your cattle on every 1 or 2 days, so you've got a very high control over your surplus and deficit of pasture, and you can react if, say, for example, when we were back in April, there was a dry spell. You've got that flexibility in the system to react to those unexpected periods of dry weather or wet weather. So in terms of the positives of these types of grazing systems, they use a high to a very high stocking density, and that gives you, and because of the subdivisions, you've got a good control over your grazing pressure. You've got prolonged and adjustable rest periods, and this discourages selective grazing, so that should prolong the longevity of your pastures. However, things that put people off these types of grazing management is the requirement for additional infrastructure. Electric fences are usually the go-to. Access to water, as you get sort of more management intensive in these systems, access to water becomes a bit of an issue, so you either need multiple water troughs for the animals to be able to access wherever they are on the grazing platform, or movable water troughs, and it's perceived to have a higher labour input and management because you're moving the animals quite frequently, and also you've got electric fences and water infrastructure to move as well. So in terms of these modern or more recent sort of grazing management systems, the key message for getting the best out of these management systems is to measure, monitor and manage your system, your farm. So there's quite a few different things to consider, such as how to measure and monitor your pasture covers. So people use sward height sticks, plate meters are becoming more common, or simply using your welly boot, but it's good to be able to measure and monitor your pasture covers so you know what you have, and then you can allocate that accordingly to your animals and the performance you need from them. As I say, what infrastructure is required, sort of how many divisions or subdivisions are you going to do, where are you going to source that infrastructure from, etc. Which grazing strategy is the best for you? I personally would suggest sort of just trying out this sort of grazing management system on a field two at a time, and just progress into this way of managing pasture, rather than sort of going straight into the deep end. There's a lot to learn, and yeah, it's good fun, but yeah, and it's got to also fit with your other priorities in terms of lifestyle and labour and things like that. So you've also got to think of your target pasture covers. I know in the dairy systems they're quite stringent on their entry and exit pasture covers. In terms of the mob grazing, there's sort of people that say that they run tall grass grazing systems, so that's actually going into higher pasture covers, and they've got a an ethos of you eat a third, you trample a third, and you leave a third. So maybe that's something that you'd be interested in trying out. And also your rotation lengths as well. So the standard rotation length is 21 days to 28 days, depending on whether you're sort of spring, summer, or autumn. But in terms of if you've got multi-species lays, they may need a longer rotation. And also in periods of sort of dry weather or wet weather, you may need to adjust that to suit. However, although it sounds like there's a lot to learn and a lot to do, these more management intensive grazing systems have been shown to increase your pasture productivity. So you basically grow more pasture. You've got better utilization. So on a set stock / continuous system, your utilization is about 50%, whereas these more intensive systems, you can get utilization up to 80–90%. And what I mean by utilization is how much of the grass that is there is going into the animal and how much is being wasted. So in terms of getting the most efficiency out of a grazing system, you want to try and get as much of that grass to go in the animal and not to be wasted through either trampling or dung and urine patches, etc. In terms of, because you've got the rotational systems, you've got options to extend your grazing season, especially when you've got wetter soil conditions. You could either move to moving your animals more frequently or giving them a larger area to graze so that you avoid poaching the soil too much. You can ultimately have higher stocking rates, and that's basically more stock on your farm, which should, in theory, if they all grow well, would be more profit at the end of the day. You get higher live weight gain per hectare. Now, this is something that's becoming increasingly talked about, is your production per hectare. In terms of sort of the grassland area and the area that we've got to be able to produce grazing livestock, that area isn't becoming any bigger. So the only ways we can really improve output is through improving the efficiency of using what we've already got. And as I say, overall, this all adds up to increased profit margin. In terms of some of these more modern grazing management styles, there are some environmental benefits, but these are all anecdotal. So these, there's very little scientific evidence to support these claims, but you do hear a lot about them. So you can lower your inputs, so you use less fertilizer, less pesticides, etc. There's a big interest at the moment in terms of sequestration of carbon to offset methane emissions of grazing livestock. And it's claimed that these types of grazing management can achieve that. You've got improved nutrient density, just because your animals are in a smaller area and they're moving regularly. They don't tend to camp as much around the field, so you don't have sort of areas that are densely dung and urinated on, and then the animals reject that pasture there. And also improves biodiversity. But as I said, there's very little conclusive scientific evidence to support these environmental claims at the moment. So, can precision farming techniques help? I've put this up. This is a survey from, well, some results from the Farm Practice Survey that was carried out in 2019 in England. And these are some various precision farming techniques that people were asked whether they use or not. The one that I'm most interested in is this one here, the pasture management, which, as I say, is quite an important aspect of improving your grazing management. And from that survey, only 9% of the people said they did some sort of pasture management. 89% said no, and 1% said didn't know. Not sure why they didn't know if they had pasture, do they manage or not, but there we go. So in terms of why these farmers were using some of those precision farming techniques, now this is not just related to the pasture management. This is all those previous types of technologies that I put up. Most of the farmers responded with they want to increase their productivity and performance, which would be a given. As I said, farming is a business at the end of the day, and that business needs to be profitable to be able to continue. 59% said they wanted to improve their accuracy, 55% to reduce their input costs, 50% said to improve animal health or welfare, 44% for soil conditions, but only 38% said they used those techniques to reduce their environmental impacts, so soil loss, emissions, etc. So that's sort of the smallest proportion of the responses. And then if we zoom in on this, the people that said they wanted to use these techniques to reduce their environmental impacts, we can see here a breakdown of the types of farms that responded. And as you can see here, grazing livestock, either lowland or less favoured area, they were the lowest proportion within this section. So I think there's much more that grazing livestock systems could do to try and improve their environmental credentials. I know there are a lot of challenges and issues in terms of bringing precision farming techniques into grazing livestock systems. I mean, right off the bat, you're talking about living, breathing animals that roam around and do all sorts of things, and that's a challenge in itself, but also there's other challenges as well. So in terms of the project that I'm working on currently in Rothamsted, I'm funded by Agritech Cornwall, which is part of the European Regional Development Fund, on the project called, well, it's just the Cell Grazing project. We didn't come up with a fancy name. So the aims of this project are basically to quantify and compare the environmental impacts of contrasting grazing management systems. So as I said, we're sort of looking at two extremes of these grazing management systems and focusing on the environmental impacts, but we're also trying to include other sustainability measures. So the two grazing systems we are comparing is set stocking, pictured here. So that's where the grazing area is continuously grazed. There's no active management of the pasture sward heights. You just put the cows out and let them get on with it. And we're comparing that with cell grazing, and the style of cell grazing that we're using is commercially known as techno grazing, which I'll explain a bit more about in a minute. And this is pictured here. So that's the intensive rotational grazing, where you've got high accuracy in terms of the stocking rate and the area you're allocating, so that you've got the best efficiency and utilization from your system. So why was this project formed? As I said earlier, a lot of the environmental claims with these more rotational management and intensive systems, there's not much science to back those claims up, so we wanted to fill that gap in the scientific literature. We want to improve overall sustainability of grazing systems. This is something that at Rothamsted, Northwick, we work a lot on. You may have heard of the Northwick Farm Platform. This experiment is separate to the farm platform, but again, it's aligned very much with improving the overall sustainability of grazing systems, and that's in terms of the economic and the environmental impacts. And also, given the current political climate, with Brexit looming, we think, and also the phasing out of the single farm platform, then this type of science is really critical and very topical at the moment, and is needed to be able to inform current and future policies around agriculture. So as I said, the cell grazing technique that we're using is known as techno-grazing. So this was pioneered by Harry Weir, who founded Kiwitech Limited in New Zealand during the 1980s. This style of grazing management has been adopted widely in New Zealand, Australia and South America. And this concept was introduced in the UK in 2016 by Precision Grazing. So as I mentioned earlier, areas of land are divided into precise lanes. So you can see this is an aerial shot of a sheep techno-grazing system in Cornwall. And you can see the lanes here. And these have got permanent fences. So there's a permanent fence that runs down here. And then these lanes are subdivided with cross fences. So these will be temporary fences that you'd move. And the area that you allocate would depend on your pasture cover or your pasture availability, your pasture quality, and your performance of the animals, or what performance you want from the animals. So the project started in April 2018. It's a 3-year project, which is due to end in March 2021. The project has used dairy cross beef steers for grazing. They're not your typical animal of a grazing system, but because this is a scientific experiment, we wanted to test it with dairy cross beef steers because they're becoming a larger proportion of the beef supply chain as a whole. And we wanted to test how well you could grow and finish dairy cross beef steers on a predominantly grass system. Through procurement rather than design, we ended up with quite a mix of breeds, but we've tried to balance those as best as possible so that we can take out the breed effect when we do the statistical analysis on the data. The experiment is set up on a typical perennial ryegrass white clover pasture, which was established in 2013. So it's now classed as a permanent pasture as it's more than 5 years old. Between 2013 and the start of this experiment, it was under varying management, mainly for cattle grazing and silage making. So there's nothing special about the pasture. It's not a new lay or anything. It's quite your typical old pasture. We've done a replicated statistical design, and in terms of the funding, so the overall project is called Agritech Cornwall. Cell grazing is a sub-project of that. The emphasis is very much on working with small to medium enterprises, and especially as it's Agritech Cornwall, Cornish and Isle of Scilly's SMEs. So these are just a few of the companies that I've worked with throughout this project as well. So we're sort of trying to make sure that this is applicable to farmers, and trying to improve that knowledge exchange about the project and getting feedback from farmers, and also trying to include some technology in the system as well, and trying to get those precision farming techniques into a grazing system. So this is a map of the experiment layout. So the yellow outlined paddocks are for set stocking, and these are 1.75 hectares in size. And then the orange outlined paddocks are the techno grazing. So from this photo, you can actually see the grazing wedge on the technos. So you can see that it's darker here, goes to light, and then lighter still. You see here that the cattle are grazing that area. So as I said, down the middle of here, there is a permanent fence, and then we use temporary cross fences to enclose those cattle into the area for that day. And in terms of the statistical design, as I say, it was replicated. So we've got 3 separate paddocks for set stocking, and then 3 separate for techno grazing, and these are all managed separately. They've got their own herd of animals allocated to that paddock, and they're just replicated as best as we can, so that we've got that statistical robustness. So this is what those paddocks look like in reality. So here we've got the set stocking animals, and they've got access to that whole 1.75 hectare area for the duration of the season, and they constantly graze in there. They usually go out around April time, and then come off about October. Northwick is situated on heavy clay soil, hence why we sort of have to turn out slightly later than ideal and bring the cattle in, because the soil conditions, once it starts getting wet, they deteriorate quite quickly. And then in this system, we use a fixed stocking rate. So for this year, we've got 8 animals on that 1.75 hectares. And I've got a picture here of the water trough system. Not very exciting, just looks like a normal water trough, which it is. And then on the right side here, we've got the cell grazing animals. So as you can see, they've got a back fence here, and this is what they grazed the day before. This is their area for grazing that day. We've got a front fence, and we've got a safety break as well, so in case they get too hungry and get into tomorrow's food. And this here is the picture of the water system that we use for the techno grazing. Because they're rotationally grazing around this system, and they can be anywhere within that 1 hectare field, and we need a water system that can move with the cattle. This here is a micro trough supplied by Kiwi Tech. So the trough itself, as you can see, is not very big, but there's a pressure plate in there. So each time they put their nose in to drink, they'll push the pressure plate and it will refill with fresh water. So I've put those in just to show the difference in the watering system. So in terms of the data that we're collecting for this project, we're taking sort of a whole system approach. So we're collecting data at all levels of the system, from soil, pasture, animal, and product. I'll give you some examples of the type of data that we're collecting. So we've got lysimeters installed underneath the paddocks, and we're collecting groundwater samples during the winter from the paddocks to see how much nutrients are leaching out of those systems during the winter. We take soil samples yearly. They're tested for nutrient analysis. We're also analysing the soil compaction in the systems. In terms of the pasture, we take botanical composition data at the start and the end of each grazing season. We take snip samples every couple of weeks, which are sent for herbage quality analysis, and we do plate meter readings every week or so, just to monitor and assess the pasture availability and pasture growth. And then in terms of the animals, we're monitoring their behaviour, health and welfare. Here there's a picture of a pedometer on one of the animals. This is to assess how many steps a day they're taking, because they've got to be fit and healthy animals. They also measure standing time, lying time, standing bouts and lying bouts. We weigh the cattle about once a month, just to record their live weight gain. And I also last year took some meat samples from animals that we slaughtered off grass, and I'm doing some carcass and meat quality assessments on them. So as I say, it's taking the whole system into account, not just focusing on one area. So in terms of some preliminary results, these are the live weight data from 2019. So SS is the set stocking and CG is the cell grazing. The cell grazing had more days on grass compared to the set stocking, mainly because with the cell grazing system we've got more control over when the soil is wetter. We can either reduce the stocking rate, give them a larger area to graze, or move them on more frequently when the soil is wet and prone to poaching. So that works out as a just under 30% increase in the number of days on grass. Here we've got the average daily gain, kilograms per day. There's no difference between the systems for that, although cell grazing was 8% higher. As I say, there's no statistical difference. This is the gain per head, so per animal. The set stocking put on average 130 kilos, during the grazing season, whereas the sow grazing animals put 181 kilos. And this is effectively a result of the number of the difference in the number of days grazing. So the sow grazing animals were on the grass for longer, so they put more weight on. This was statistically different, with the sow grazing being 39% higher gain per head. But as I say, that is a artifact of the number of days grazing. And then this is the key interest in this type of grazing system, is this gain per hectare. So on the set stocked animals, they did 371. So this is the gain for the group, not individually. So on average, each set stocked system, remember there's 3 of them, that they produced 371 kilograms of live weight for the cattle, whereas the sow grazing animals, they produced 542 kilograms of live weight. And this is almost a 50% increase in the gain per hectare. And annoyingly, that was just on the border of being significant. But maybe this year we will see that that will be a significant difference, but we're only halfway through this year. So that's quite positive, and also backs up the other economic related data that has been published previously. Here we've got the average pasture cover for each of the systems for each of the years. So the dotted lines with the square are the sow grazing, and then the solid lines with the circle are the set stocking. In 2018, we obviously had the very dry year, which was really not the most ideal year to begin a grazing system experiment, but we trudged on through. 2019 was a much better year, and then we're getting that data through slowly for 2020. You might notice that our pasture covers are higher than ideal, especially in 2018. This was because we were actually understocked for the early part of the season. We had a very wet spring that year, so grass growth was stunted, but once it dried up enough for the grass to get going, it went going, and yeah, we basically had grass coming out of our ears and not enough cattle to manage that. But then that surplus pasture actually came in useful during the dry June, July and August, and we used that to fill that gap. And luckily we didn't need to supplement these animals, so they were purely on grass for that year. And then in terms of the environmental results, everyone keeps asking me about these, and I'm very excited to see them as well. But due to the time-related sort of issue with environmental results, as I said, this experiment was established in 2018, and some of these environmental differences take a few years to start to appear. I won't be able to report these results until we've finished this grazing season, so that we have 3 separate years to be able to analyse those results. But here I've got the, well, just a snippet of the soil data from 2018, 19 and 20. So as you can see, the pH isn't really that different between the sow grazing or the set stocking. Started at 6 or 6.2, went up in 2019 and down again in 2020. The phosphorus has increased on both of the systems. Interestingly, the phosphorus for sow grazing in 2020 is much higher, well, noticeably higher than for the set stocking. I am going to take more soil samples in spring 2021 to be able to confirm this, just so that it's not an artifact of the data or some sampling issue. Same with potassium, slowly increasing, but no real difference between the numbers. And soil organic matter started at a very similar percentage, 8.4, 8.5. Set stocking has gone up to 9.5 over the last 3 years, and the sow grazing has excitingly gone up to 10.3. As I said, there's a lot of interest in soil carbon sequestration, and there's talk about carbon credits and paying farmers for sequestering carbon. So that's quite an exciting result. But again, I'd like to wait till 2021 to be able to confirm that that is a real observation. So this is just a little snippet that I found on a YouTube video. For the life of me, I can't re-find that video, but it was a very good presentation about sort of rotational grazing. And this resonated with me. And the speaker basically said, you can either spend your time trying to purchase land and expand, which, as I said, very difficult. Land prices are very high, and that expansion is kind of becoming sort of non-realistic. And he said, or you could change the way that you graze what you already have, and thus improve your efficiency, your productivity, your utilization, and get basically the same or better production of a smaller area of land by using these grazing management systems. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was genuinely fascinating. I'm only going to ask one question because I think we're in danger of falling a little bit behind time at this stage. What I will say, though, is for those that have sent me questions privately, if you repost them generally into the chat, then Sarah can see them, and perhaps during the next talk she can respond accordingly to each one if you'd
that's
care
fine
to re-ask the questions. But to ask one, though, very quickly, you mentioned the carbon element a moment ago from the climate change point of view. But in terms of weather patterns, which are obviously becoming increasingly erratic at this stage and a little less predictable perhaps than they once were, what influence do you think that will have on future grazing management strategies?
So I've already sort of, I wouldn't say massively extremes, but had personal experience of some of the extremes we can see. When I moved down to Devon in 2018 and really didn't expect a couple of months of bright sunshine, but there we go. It was nice at the time. So I think in terms of grazing management going forward, and in terms of a more variable climate, it's really important to be able to have that capacity in your management system to be able to respond and change and be adaptable to new or predicted sort of changes in weather patterns. So an important piece of information that helps with that is feed budgeting, which you can use your pasture cover data and your expected animal production, and then budget your feed accordingly. And that will help you see any surpluses or deficits in your feed budget. So if you see in sort of the next month or two that there's going to be a deficit because it's predicted to be a dry month, then you can buy extra feed in early. And equally, if you see surpluses, you can shut up paddocks and cut that and conserve that for feeding at a later date. But it's definitely about the being open-minded and adaptable in those systems.
Thank you. That was it. In which case, then I shall now pass back to Hazel, who's going to introduce our third speaker. As was said before, you're going to have to imagine your applause, I'm afraid, because of the nature of the event. But thank you very much. That was an excellent talk.